Okay, tonight we're going to make a lot of progress on paper 3. I highly recommend you have your laptop. If you have your laptop open with your company open and the Walmart file open, you could probably get some of your paper 3 written in class, at least get the graphs in and look at the titles. If you look at the rubric, there's a very specific rubric for paper 3 that you have to follow. You don't have any choice on this one. Follow it very, very closely. I want you to have a template when you leave here that you can, is a go-to template you can use for any company. Works really well. The only place that doesn't work well is banks and insurance companies. There's a few places, especially turnover, that don't make a lot of sense, but it's the categories are still there. So liquidity tends to be the most difficult one. Here, we're going to look at 3 things. And so what you're going to do with your file is the print page 2 has the graphs. So as I said, create a separate sheet where you take your graph, copy it over, edit the column, the title, change the axis if you need to. I don't know, sometimes starting at 0 makes a lot of sense. So I'm not sure it makes sense to really radically change it, but you certainly can. So change your title, whatever you're trying to explore, and then copy and paste it into your paper. I recommend paste it as a bitmap, mainly because the other forms tend to mess up the x-axis especially. So let's walk through this. In your paper, you won't have all of this. So you're just going to start the paper. It doesn't make sense to have an abstract, paper inside a paper. You don't have to have the big letter starting at the beginning either. I don't know how to get rid of that. So those kind of things. This is written as an independent paper, but you're doing a paper within a paper. So just follow your form and your color coding and all that. You can switch as well. So I even have it numbered. So you got 3 things you have to do here. It even says first, second, and third. Did we start this last class? I can't remember. Did we start this last class? So I think we were about to start this, right? And we just didn't get to it. So, all right. So the very first thing we're going to do, let me how to get rid of the, delete the header, but I'm sure there's a way to do that I don't know how to do. Yeah. All right. So my Microsoft Word skills are a little old. So the first one's very simple. You just want to look at cash from operations and explain it. Does it look good or does it look bad? So Walmart, one thing you notice is it has been declining fairly significantly since 2016. Then you see COVID, and then you see post-COVID. So most of y'all are going to have some COVID comments on the business. One thing that's really important on this, on cash from operations, is several of my ratios take a number divided by CFO. So if CFO has some noise in it, it's probable you're going to see noise coming from those ratios as well. So I said CFO compound annual growth rate has been a very weak minus 0.63%. I mentioned COVID-19, but so when I did the paper last year, man, everything was wonderful. But my question was how much of that's going to go away once COVID goes away. So you're just describing this chart, what's going on with CFO. Students have asked me, what if there's a big jump in 2014 and comes back down? If you have an answer for that, say. If you don't, you could probably ignore it because that was 8 years ago. You don't need to explain something that happened 8 years ago. You do have to explain something that happened here recently. So if COVID's causing noise and you think it's COVID, then put that in there. I was just looking at Chipotle earlier. Chipotle didn't do well during COVID, but then came up really strong after COVID, which kind of makes somewhat of sense. DoorDash and all of that. So yeah, you see some jumps that may not be necessarily related to COVID, so you can't just assume. I would think Chipotle probably had some following coming out of COVID. People are just tired of eating at home. All right, so that's the first one. Do you have any questions on that? Are your firms having any serious negative numbers here? I'm hoping none of you are having those kind of problems. Yeah, what? Oh, yeah. Well, hopefully, yeah. If it doesn't, you just got to, when you get to paper 3, just go through 2020 and just pretend like it's there. I can't imagine it won't update by then. Maybe, and if I have some time, maybe I can. I don't know how much manual keying that would be. Is it available anywhere? Has their annual report come out?
Parts of it have, and they're missing like their cash flows.
But their actual annual report hasn't come out yet, or
they had their some parts of their 2021 out.
that's strange. I wonder what
They're missing,
happened.
like depreciation, and missing a lot of key aspects of the cash
Wow, I
flows.
wonder if the CFO quit or something. That's strange. Yeah, you think that would be a pretty easy one to do. All right, so that one's just explain. You're essentially just explaining the chart. Remember, on the CAGR only looks at 2 points: your first point and your last point. If that doesn't explain your graph, then you need to give some discussion in between. Especially if you have a company that's just been growing. This is kind of the issue we had last year with COVID. Growing, then suddenly it drops. Then you probably want to do a growth rate through that second to last number, and then say, so they were growing at 8% up until 2020 or up until 2019, and then it dropped because of COVID. So you may have to calculate an extra growth rate. You should do that pretty easily in the Excel spreadsheet. All right, the second one is where most people struggle. So we talked about this. If your working capital assets are less than your working capital liabilities, that's a source. That's great. Your firm is very liquid if it's a source. Most companies, it's not, it's a use, but for a good significant portion of companies, it is a source. If it's a source, then you can say that's great for liquidity, very liquid company. Now we just need to look at the trend. If it's a use, I have students say it's a use of cash, therefore management is a bunch of bums. They don't know what they're doing, but that's too harsh. Most companies, it's a use. So you say if it's a use, it's a use for most companies. So our focus is going to be on the trend. You can't just say they're horrible at liquidity, and it's not. That's pretty typical. The other issue you're going to have for some companies is it's a use and a source. Like, I don't think anyone's doing Lululemon, but Lululemon is just a minuscule number. Sometimes it's a little bit positive, sometimes a little bit negative, but in that case, it's just it's like they manage it to 0, which is really pretty good. In that case, you don't make a big deal by it being a use or a source. It's just that it's just a small number. It's not that material. Now, what I do is on the trend is I compare the net working capital to CFOs. So again, if your CFO is volatile, it can cause this number to be volatile. So one thing you might want to do is just look at the working capital requirement itself. On print page 1, you just look at the numbers themselves. You can see Walmart's has been really volatile, but a lot of that's, and their 1920s are really confusing numbers because of when their fiscal years end. So really difficult numbers, but really volatile. But their CFO has also been somewhat volatile. And so that's going to cause some noise, but it's always been a source. It was a massive source in 2020. It's gotten back to a little bit more normal, but then it became much less of a source in 2019. You look at the numbers. Don't just look at the CFO to net working capital to CFO. Now, if your CFO is really, really messed up, you might substitute a chart. Instead of showing this chart, we talked about this earlier, you might do net working capital, not to CFO, but to what? To revenue, right? Revenue tends to be a much more stable number. I think I did this with Walmart, but it might give you a little bit less of the noise. Here, it's still coming down and it's still volatile, but it shows a very different picture. So think other creative ways. So just because I gave you the number as percentage of CFO, you can substitute others. So it just depends on your company. You can see why I use real life numbers and I don't give you cases, because this is what you got to deal with. All right. Anybody, I know at least a fourth of you have some major problem with this chart. You want it to be lower. Negative is a source, positive is a use. You want it to be lower. If you have CFO, remember CFO is negative, that's when you really have to find another substitute for your company. And that's where probably net working capital, the revenue works well because revenue can't be negative. So that helps. So you just substitute that for this chart and redo that. Just change the title of the chart. Then the question is, why did that change? Well, really what we're looking for here is why did net working capital change? We're not looking at why this ratio changed because CFO might be part of it. So why did it change? That's where you come to the very bottom of print page 1. And I gave you this breakout here. You're trying to see why did it jump from 8 billion to 18 billion. And you can see it's in other current liabilities. That jumped dramatically. And then in 2021, we kind of saw that, right? Their inventories jumped a bunch. That's an issue. Does the market care about inventories? Did y'all see this article? Nike stock plunges as investors trip over all that inventory. Do markets care about inventory? Yeah, pretty important stuff. Their stock plunge. Someone's doing Nike, right? Who's doing Nike in here? Yeah. Did you notice that? Has it come back since the last few days? So 10%, that's a pretty good drop. As the sneaker giants, sneakers, latest earnings, most active. While the company reaffirmed its full-scale sales outlook, Nike quarterly outlook was littered with red flags. The company's earnings call also isn't winning fans. So anyway, I don't know why they put that picture in there. Is that one of their advertising? It's while becoming a painful cycle. Nike again beats, but missed margins and guided down. The sales beat. They haven't mentioned inventories yet, but inventories was a huge issue for Walmart as well, and you certainly see that in these numbers. Inventories really shouldn't be jumping like that all in 1 year. That's kind of bizarre. So that's an issue, and so that's the main reason it dropped from 2020 to 21 is that inventories dropped so much. But the reason it improved from 2019 to 2020 is because of this other current liabilities. So what jumped in other current liabilities? If you want to go find it out, you certainly can. You just go in the annual report and you try to find a line item and other current liabilities that jumped dramatically and try to figure that out. I did that for Walmart. It had something to do with something bizarre, some subsidiary that they did. So I didn't, and really, it wasn't so much that it jumped in 2020, it's that it dropped so much in 2019 and it came back in 2020. So, try your best to try to figure out what's going on here. I actually think, as an actual stock analyst, you don't want to try to figure this out. You have to figure it out. You got to know this company backwards and forwards. So if there's something bizarre happening here, you got to figure out what are the accountants doing to me here. I've got to understand this. If you can't understand it, then you pick up the phone, you call your sell side representative and say, JP Morgan, hey, what's going on here? Why did that number jump? And that's what they're paid for. You're paying them all this money. That's what they're paid for. So they'll know the answer to that. And they probably will know it off the top of their head. That's, a lot of the sales side, they follow, 10, 20 companies, and that's it for 2,000 hours a year. So you think about that's 200 hours per company. They're going to know their company pretty well. So, and the accounting for it. And they're all in the same industry too. So they know each other's, there's a lot of overlap. All right. So this one's tough. You got to make some decisions about how you're going to explain that. Some students go in and just edit the numbers and leave all the Walmart language there. You can't do that. All right. Some places you're going to have to wipe out the entire paragraph and write it from scratch because it won't apply to your company. All right. Questions on that one, because that is a tough one. If you're having struggles there, then Zoom, set up a Zoom with me, come by. I'll meet, if you want to go through the whole paper, I'll go through the whole paper. I prefer that you highlight the sections that you're struggling with because a lot of it is pretty straightforward. I was meeting with a student earlier that in another class, and they essentially just wanted me to write their paper with them as they go through it, which is fine. I'll help them, give them some ideas. I'd rather they do everything they can do and then come to me on the hard stuff because y'all can do 80% of this without my help. But if you want me to walk through, but do as much as you can, at least get the graphs in there and try to word it as best you can. And then I would say highlight in yellow what you're struggling with. I'm going to be making stuff up on some of these places because I don't know these companies in detail and I don't know these industries. These are not my industries. but I'll make up stuff that I can think of as probably as well as you can. Or if you want to dive into the annual report and try to figure out the exact answer of why it happened, we can certainly do that. We can usually find an answer from most companies. All right, y'all stop me if you want me to. So the third thing we're going to look at is this firm producing free cash flows? We want firms producing healthy free cash flows that are growing. So the first evidence we have of that, are they sending money to their stock and bond holders? So you can see Walmart, very, as we saw earlier, very consistent dividends, some fairly hefty stock buybacks, borrowed a lot of money to buy Flipkart, but they've been paying that back. They paid out $20 billion last year. Definitely evidence of very, very strong free cash flows. Now, this is where your firm's going to be all over the place. I don't know, Ashley, what is Domino's? A bunch of red bars. Is it anything but red bars that they pay dividends? Not sure. Yeah, I'm kind of curious if they're borrowing money to pay the red back. So yeah, so Domino's has bought so much of their stock back, their net worth is going negative. But are they borrowing to do that? If they're borrowing to do that, that's not free cash flow. You've got to borrow money to buy back stock. You don't have free cash flow. You're using the bond market to do that. If they're not borrowing money and they're just paying it out, then that's evidence of free cash flow. So there's 20 billion. Obviously, Walmart is very cash rich. 20 billion is not a small amount of money. That's, you know, they could buy USA with $20 billion almost. So it's not an inconsequential amount of money. So obviously a lot of free cash flow has been growing dramatically the last few years. This is a one-time thing to buy another firm. So that's somewhat, and it's actually pretty impressive that they've paid back most of that debt since then. So, but the question is this a reflection of free cash flow, or are they reducing their CapEx? So that's the other thing you do, say, you know what, we can't find anything to do with our money. We've been building as many stores as we can. You cut back on CapEx, that's not a free cash flow, it's a shift in your cash flow. Instead of CapEx, you're doing stock buybacks. So you look at, again, we had a number as a percentage of CFO. Their CapEx had been declining, but since 2016, it's been increasing quite dramatically. So you really can't argue that there's cash to their stockholders because they're cutting back CapEx, because CapEx has stayed pretty. And remember, this is a percentage of CFO. So if CFO is growing, CapEx is growing even faster. So strong evidence that Walmart is producing free cash flows. And I do think they are. It's a very competitive market, but they're doing well. This company is doing well. It's just been intense competition. So definitely a very, very liquid company. The liquidity seems to be getting stronger. That's not where Walmart's struggling. Walmart's struggling on turnover, but they're doing well on liquidity. And we'll talk about, you know, there's a tie between turnover and liquidity, but bottom line, their liquidity is really good because they're really strong at inventory turn and those type of things you would expect a discount retailer to be strong at. All right. Can y'all handle liquidities? So the downside is liquidity is the hardest. So you start with that and you get demoralized. The good part is it's first, so it gets easier after that. Solvency is usually pretty easy for most people.
Where's operations broken down of Excel?
Well, it's on print page 1 online.
I see the value, but I want to see it's broken down because for that, for me, I have a significantly different number from year to year.
Well, if something's going on that you can't explain by the net working capital, then you essentially have to go to the annual report and you have to look at the detailed lines. So you're doing UPS, is that right? Or FedEx? You're UPS and you're FedEx, Alina. Okay, let's look at it.
Back here, net working capital fund as CFO. Well, sorry, net working capital requirement basically stayed the same from the previous year, but CFO was like 1,000.
Yeah, it's possible.
Whereas the previous
You're talking about a firm with a massive probably pension plan and those kind of things, and they can have significant pension cash flows. Let's find the actual annual report. Are they view annual report? I don't want to view it. I just want to. So there's their CFO, a new CEO. When did she join the firm? Pretty recently, right? She looks happy, but I bet she's pretty stressed. Not an easy firm. Who is that? That's the CEO. That's chairman. All right, let's see if we can find financials here. You know, I always get excited when I see a chart. You know, look through, you might find a chart you can really use in your paper because management should know what's important to them. Have y'all just kind of glanced through your entire annual report, all 200 and something pages of it, and see if there's something interesting? It looks, I'm actually seeing stuff in some pretty interesting. I'm tempted to just stop because it's really interesting stuff. There's operating expenses. How detailed do they get on their expenses? That can be really, really interesting. More than likely, if they have these type of numbers on their annual report, you can get them out of Capital IQ at that level and type exactly those words in the Capital IQ and see if you can find them. You can find some really interesting things. All right, sorry. It is too many pages, but I may have already passed it, but consolidated cash flows, page 61. So we're getting close. All right, so let's see. First of all, are there any big numbers that stand out to you? Right there. They're spending $2 to $3 billion a year on pensions. That doesn't go through working capital, doesn't even go through net income. Can you believe that? You spend $3 billion in pension plan, it doesn't affect net income at all. All right, so that's a big problem you have. They have a big pension plan, $3 billion, they spent 500 million. Here's another one. Post-retirement. So sometimes it's income, sometimes it's expense. So the contributions don't affect the income statement. The gains and losses on your pension plan go through the income statement, have nothing to do with cash. So they have to adjust those back. It's a mess, and those are big numbers. They're going both directions. So in 2019, it hardly impacts you at all because they offset each other. Here you got about $4 billion. Here you got about $3 billion. You got a deferred tax issue going on. That's a fairly sizable number. Down here, you don't need to worry about this because that's in your net working capital, so that you're already assessing that. So those you have. But that's what I do. I just looking, what are the big items? So here's depreciation. That's pretty stable. That's not going to have much of an impact. And Stefan, on that chart, 4, 5, chart 6, I think it is, the one with all the bars. All this stuff here is going to just show up in that other, and you're going to see some big blue bars on the other on that chart. So Stefan, this might be a reason for you to, instead of doing those charts to CFO, instead do them the revenue, because you got some noise because you got a big pension plan. Not many firms have big pension plans, do they anymore? You don't have to worry about it. What about 401k? Where does that go? Doesn't even exist. As far as they're concerned, 401k plan doesn't exist. It's on their balance sheet. The funding doesn't, it's an expense. When they contribute to your 401k, that's just a pension, that's just a payroll expense, but it just, there's nothing else goes through. But pension plans are massive. They can be huge dollar amounts. Those looked at my risk class. Remember we talked about pension plans and just how large that can be for, you know, about 5-10% of the firms out there. So UPS is one of those stuff, and you're gonna have to mess with pension plans. In your paper too, you might have to have a paragraph on pension plans. No, do your net working capital to revenue and do your CapEx to revenue. So those charts that are doing dividing by CFO instead use revenue. And you can do that right on print page 1. Just change the formula and it will change everything else. That makes sense? If you're not sure, Stefan, you can call me or email me and we can walk you through. Wow, it was interesting flipping through that. It makes you want to do that with other companies. Other questions on liquidity? You're gonna have at least one mess on liquidity you have to deal with. You can see with Stefan, you have that. Those of you who firm sold a big entity, you're gonna have either major realized gain or loss that's gonna be adjusted out. That's gonna be an issue. So, maybe I should redo that Excel spreadsheet and give you a choice between those at CFO or revenue. Have you 2 charts and you can pick which one makes the most sense. All right, I'm going to keep going unless y'all stop me. So Walmart looks very, very good on liquidity. So let's jump over to solvency ratios. Much easier. So solvency, there's really 2 things we look at solvency. One is your ability to repay your debt, and the other is how much debt you have. So can you pay your debt back, and how much debt do you have? So the most common that you hear about is debt to equity, but you probably won't hear it much when you graduate. I don't know anyone that uses that. Hardly anyone uses debt to equity anymore. Almost everyone uses debt to EBITDA. I know the guys at Victory Capital and gals at Victory Capital, they use debt to EBITDA. And does that make sense? So you're going to buy a house. I seriously doubt your bank's going to ask you how much debt you're going to have versus your net worth. Did they even ask you your net worth? They probably don't, do they? A lot of people your age, their net worth is negative if they have any student debt. But they might ask your debt to your earnings. Would that make sense? That makes a lot of sense. If you loan someone, if someone's borrow $500,000, they ask them, hey, what's your net worth? Or you ask them, what's your annual income? You probably won't know their annual income. Well, same thing with corporations. Debt to EBITDA makes a lot more sense than debt to equity. And actually, you can't even do debt to equity, right? Because you don't have any equity. So anything to equity just doesn't work if you have negative equity. But debt to EBITDA makes a lot of sense. Or debt to EBIT. But I think I set yours up for debt to EBITDA, but I'm not sure. It might be debt to EBIT. I have to go back and look. That's one error I have on the charts is like with net margin and debt to EBIT. I'm not always clear if I'm using EBIT or EBITDA. So we'll have to just be really clear on that. Later, when we do ROE decomposition, we're actually going to do assets to net worth. And that's just the way the ROE decomposition works. So that's the only reason I'm using there, so we can use that formula. We're not going to use it in this part of the paper. All right. So those are ratios that ask, do you have too much debt? And is 7 too high? Is 12 too high? Is 2 too high? The answer is, what do your peers look like? What does the industry look like? There are no rules of thumb for everybody. Tech stocks, it's going to be really, really low. Tech companies tend not to have much debt. Utilities, it's massive. It's a huge number. So it just depends. Airlines have a lot of debt because they got a lot of planes. That's collateral. Utilities have very stable income. Tech stocks, they don't have stable income. They're in a very competitive environment. People don't like to give them debt. So it depends on your industry. There are some industries, some companies in industries like an Intel that might have a lot of debt because of the nature of their assets. They have a lot of assets. They can back up the debt. So you really don't know until you look at the industry. And then can you pay your debt times interest earned, or the debt? You might have heard this as the debt coverage ratios. So your net income, some measure of net income, EBIT over your interest expense. I don't use this ratio much because I'm doing banking and insurance, and that ratio doesn't make any sense to banking and insurance. But you heard a lot. Y'all heard coverage ratio probably more than times interest earned. So I've never thought that it was all that strong of a ratio, but Damodaran, listen to his lectures when he does optimal capital. he uses times interest earned as his only proxy for credit ratings, which I don't know if it works. I've never tried to do that type of analysis before. I don't know why I switched fonts right here. There's not like that's a really important paragraph, so you can switch it back to an 11. Here we do have rules of thumb. 2 is weak, 10 is great. So if your firm is at 74 and it drops to 50, it's really not a big deal. They're still at 50. Why did it go from 74 to 50? Is because they increased their debt? No, it's because their earnings are fluctuating around. So EBIT moves around, so your ratio is going to move around. But if you're above 10, I wouldn't worry about it.
So mine was 108, and then it dropped 50, and it goes back to 140.
Yeah, that's because its earnings is fluctuating around.
So there's no issue.
You can look at the interest line and it's probably pretty stable. It's the earnings. So if you're above 10, I say don't even mention it. Even if it's been declining over time, it's probably because the earnings are declining over time. But at some point, if it falls below 10, that's when you start saying, okay, now we're starting to get a little shaky, even though 10 is still strong. But you drop down to 10, now you're getting to the level where, a recession or something like that, you're going to drop down. So we usually below 2, you start getting a little nervous. Start getting nervous. Below 1, it just means their interest expense is going to put them negative, and so they can't cover it. So higher is better. Just remember it's times interest earned. I see students doing times interest earned, and they do times interest earned 15, and they say 15%. It's not 15%. That would be a really bad ratio. So it's 15 times earnings, not 15% of earnings. Now, firms can have other debt-like things like capital leases, especially insurance companies, reserves, and those kind of things. UPS probably has capital leases, or FedEx probably. Yeah, you can include those in the ratio if it makes sense. You have to kind of decide. I don't think I pulled those numbers, so all you have is debt. So it might be something to think about that can influence the ratio. Well, did I switch the 12 font to just right here for some reason? All right, so that's all we're looking for on solvency. It's pretty straightforward. Times interest earned and debt to EBITDA. Higher is worse. Debt to EBITDA. Higher is better on times interest earned. You're trying to see where are they versus the industry, where are they over time, is it going up or going down? Now, some of your firms don't have interest. So I was looking at Chipotle. I can't explain Chipotle. So Chipotle, their interest expense is a negative number. So they don't have interest expense. They had no debt for like 8 years, and their interest expense is negative. Then suddenly they have $3 billion in debt, but they have no interest expense, and their cash flow statement doesn't show them issuing any debt. I don't know what the accountants are doing. So give them a prize for creative accounting. So why doesn't their cash for investing show debt when their balance sheet suddenly shows $3 billion in debt show up? I can't answer that question. Frustrating, isn't it? And none of you are doing Chipotle, I don't think, but really frustrating. But you may see something like that. I can't answer those questions. It's really strange. I think I can even show it to you. Really, really frustrating. If I could spell Chipotle ever. Is that it? There it is. I should just say Mexican Grill so I can remember the ticker, but I can't remember the ticker either. So you look at their financials on their balance sheet. They have $3.3 billion. Well, that says capital lease, so maybe that's the issue. That could be it. Long-term capital leases. Maybe that's why it's not showing up. So there's maybe the solution right there. Found it. Yeah. So maybe when I do debt, somehow I pulled in the capital lease. I wasn't trying to do that. So I don't know. You have, be warned that can be an issue. Why would Chipotle have capital leases? So it's a good question on restaurants. Do they own their stores or not? And if they don't own their stores, is it a capital lease? So is Chipotle not owning their stores, but they do capital leases, so it shows up as a capital lease? I don't know. That'd be something you have to research. I was talking to a guy from HEB, going through some of the numbers, how I'd look at HEB, and he said, well, HEB, they don't make money from groceries. And what did he say? Where do they make their money? What is HEB? Is it a grocery store? It's a real estate company. It says we make money from renting out. So it's a really pretty good model. If you think about it, they're a really good anchor store. You'd want to be next to an HEB, wouldn't you? If you're a hairstylist or whatever, Weight Watchers. It's a really good anchor store, clean, well taken care of, highly respected entity. They say that's where they make their money, is from real estate. So I mean, interesting. I wish I could see that, but we can't see their numbers. But so you'd be surprised some of these companies get into and say, wow, what are they doing? Does McDonald's own their stores? Well, the franchises do. How does that show up in their balance sheet at the corporate level? So there are some frustrations that you have. So we're going to look at times interest earned. We're going to look at debt, EBITDA. And then what we're going to do is I've moved this down. We're going to have an overall summary of liquidity and solvency. And there's two things we're going to look at there: quality of earnings and the credit ratings. But any questions on debt? Now, if your firm has no debt, if you're Lululemon, then you kind of get a freebie on the points. You still talk about it, say, I cannot show my firm's times interest earned or debt to EBITDA because they don't have debt. And you're out of the woods. Now, you can ask the question, why doesn't Lululemon have debt? Because you remember Miller, Minty, Downey, they should have debt. That maximizes the value of the firm. I don't know the answer to that. They're a Canadian company. Does that make a difference? Why I don't like debt? I don't know the answer to that. I was talking to William. We're looking at the loan to deposit ratios for banks. So one of the best loan to deposit ratios in the country is what bank? What do you think? It's a bank you all know very well. Some of y'all probably bank there. I wasn't thinking that. I have to look them up. I was thinking something more local. Yeah, Frost has an incredibly low loan deposit ratio. That's what makes them such a great takeover candidate. So they're like at 30%. Typical banks, 60, 70%. Why don't they loan out more? They're just really conservative. Well, William was looking at a French bank, it was like 100%. Say, why are you 100%? Well, I don't know, but you start guessing. My guess is, well, Europe doesn't have a good FDIC program. How much money would you give Frost Bank if there was no FDIC insurance? And would you take a 2% CD from Frost Bank if there's no FDIC? So if Europe doesn't have strong FDIC, does that make it more difficult for them to get deposits? Maybe that's it. I don't know. I'm just guessing. So why doesn't Lululemon have debt? I don't know the answer to that. Is it in their annual report? I don't know. Could you Google it? Someone should Google it. Why doesn't Lululemon have debt? It'd be interesting to see why they don't have debt. But you get somewhat of freebie on this part of the paper. I don't know if any of your firms does not have any debt at all. I seriously doubt that. Probably most of y'all have some debt. So, right. So let's get through this conclusion part here. So, quality of earnings. What do we mean by quality of earnings? So there's so many different ways to do it. I show you that book, Financial Shenanigans. I'm somewhat stealing a little bit from his book, but what I want to do is focus here. So this is the only thing we do. There's a lot of things we can do. But one thing the Financial Shenanigans say is when management lies on the income statement, they have to have an equal offsetting lie on the cash flow statement. What we're trying to do is find those disconnects. And so what I did is I created this chart. Now, one thing to be careful of this paper I've given you, 80% of it is normal and 20% of it is sweet. So you need to know when you got the sweet stuff. So that I've had students go into interviews and they talk about stuff that's sweet stuff like it's normal. Like everybody in finance knows it, and they're like, what are you talking about? So this is this is the sweet stuff. I like this chart, but don't talk about this chart like it's normal because no one else would use this chart. Times interest earned, debt to EBITDA, everybody knows that. That's perfectly fine. But this is different. So what I'm doing here, I like it. I think it works pretty well. But if you use it in an interview, explain it as if you came up with it. You don't have to give me credit. So the top of this is cash from operations. And the blue is net income. So what I'm asking is, how do we get from net income to CFO? Are we adding? Are we subtracting? Which would you be more comfortable with? Would you want CFO to be higher than net income or you lower than net income? What makes you more comfortable? Be higher, wouldn't it? If someone says, hey, my net income's 100,000 a year, I have a cash flow of 5,000. You say, wait, where's the other 95,000 going? Like, well, I got this boat I'm buying that comes right out of my bank account. I got, so most firms, you're going to add back depreciation. So that by itself is probably going to make your CFO higher. Then you got working capital, where working capital can be positive or negative, and it's going to bounce around. You kind of expect that to bounce around. What you don't want to see is it's a negative number that's just getting more and more negative. You're having a problem with inventory, so having a problem with receivables. That number just grows and grows and grows. So you kind of expect it. It's not bad that it's negative. You just don't want to be negative and growing negative. And then the other thing is the other. And so, Stefan, your chart 7, my guess is you got some massive blue charts.
That year specifically, net income was negative for like the first time, whatever. That's like the main difference. Now we are.
And you have a big blue bar
Well, in that year.
in that year. Yeah. Well, I bet you have others. This is where your pension fundings are going to go. This is where those realized gains and losses are going to go. It's going to be that number. I'm not worried if it's a 1-year thing, but if you got a bunch of those, especially if they're negative, if they're positive, it doesn't bother me so much. Say, hey, we need more cash. You know, if your friend says, hey, my income's 50,000, but I'd bring home 70,000 a year, you're like, okay, that sounds kind of sweet. How are you doing that? It might mean he has pay them back, you know, in the future sometime, but when I see a huge blue bar, I'm somewhat curious what's going on there. If I see a big blue bar every single year, then I'm really curious. What in the world is that? Because you really shouldn't see that. Most firms shouldn't see that. Any of your firms seen something like that, where it's just this massive blue bar? You are? Yeah, I can't think of it. But it's not every single year. So my guess is when they got rid of corner store, that probably caused one. And I don't know what year that was, maybe 17 or 19. Pension fundings, Valero may have a pension plan. Those are the two biggest ones. Pensions and realized gains and losses are the two biggest ones you'll see. Now, realized gain will cause a negative blue bar, because that's something that went through net income that really propped up net income, but that cash flow goes for the investing cash flow, not through not through CFO, so they subtract it out. So that wouldn't necessarily be a negative thing if it was kind of a one-time thing. So I don't know how wild this is going to be. Most of y'all are going to say, I don't see any major problems. So don't just assume that. Do look at it and see if there is anything curious. I love this chart because this chart raises questions that really help you understand the company. There's stuff that just comes out of the woodwork that you're like, wow, I didn't know they were doing that. That's really strange. Why did that jump like that? So try to struggle with that. But for most firms, CFO will be much higher than net income, and that just gives me comfort that, yeah, okay, things look pretty normal. That's what you would expect, mainly because of depreciation. All right, does that chart make sense for y'all? Anybody have a wild chart there? It's off some wild. Deferred tax, I tried to break that out. Boy, that's a tough one. That's where the accountants are getting a little too creative for me. It's really hard for me to find that number because not everybody reports it the same way. So it's a messy number. And I don't know if y'all did deferred taxes in accounting. Do they cover it all? I mean, it's ridiculous, isn't it? Someone said, hey, can we do an accounting pronouncement that Albert Einstein could never figure out? That's what they came up with, deferred tax. It's just ridiculous how complicated that is. So I don't even know what it means economically. You know, it's just hard to figure out. All right. So I'm going to say, okay, so you read the paragraph. I like to compare cash from operations and net income over time to see if it raises any concerns about quality or reported earnings. Why do I have this under solvency and liquidity right here? Firms going through financial difficulty are often motivated to manage earnings by managing accruals, and this manipulation would stand out as an unusual departure between cash from operations and net income. You can leave this sentence in there word for word. I really like this sentence. I mean, if you can word it better, that's fine. Maybe I'll steal your wording. But most students just leave it word for word. Someone was asking me, well, what about plagiarism? Then yeah, this paper plagiarism is not that big of an issue. I will look through just in case your entire paper is exactly the same word for word another student's paper from like a previous semester or something. But you know, if it's not, I haven't understood. I've heard some professors that count out points based on the plagiarism, and they start cutting off like at 40 or 50. Have you seen a paper with 40%? I mean, there's like 2 lines that are marked. It's ridiculous. So you should definitely challenge that back. I look, and when it says 40, I'll look, and I'm just amazed how little is actually highlighted. A lot of times it's just, they're just highlighting some article that they reference. And I don't know what the 40% means, because it's certainly not 40% of the paper. So I don't know if they're saying there's a 40% chance that there's some plagiarism going on. I really don't know exactly what that means. But so if you have a professor that does that, tell them they should email me, and I want to have a debate with them. I just want to debate another professor. All right. No, just anybody. That's got to get all my aggression out somehow. All right. And then you have a final recommendation, final overall. This overall is liquidity and solvency. And here's where you're going to say, you know what, I think I understand my company, but it'd be really nice if there was someone else out there that knew my company as well or better than I did. And yeah, there is. It's called S&P and Moody's credit ratings. Walmart is AA rated. Obviously, a strong company. That's a really, really good credit rating, especially in this environment. Why do we have 2 AAAs left? Here you got a AA. I don't need the AA plus or minus. Just if it's AA1, AA2, AA, just do AA. That's fine enough. I did put the 2 in there. I guess I did. I take it back, but AA. And then I give you the credit rating somewhere out there. I forget where I put them. They may be under. I think I'm. Let's see. There it is. It's under paper rubrics. It says credit rating definitions. So if you want to copy and paste those in. So very, very strong. Now, a few of your firms will not have credit ratings. I don't think in this class. I think NVIDIA is probably rated. Any of y'all not have credit ratings? It's at the very bottom of print page 1. When you go to print page 1, it's the very, very last thing on that page. If you have NAs, then your firm's just not rated. So if your firm's not rated, just say my firm doesn't have credit rating. However, looking at the Bloomberg probability of default. One thing I'd recommend that you do, that if you don't have a credit rating, go to the Bloomberg machine and look up your firm. So you just type your firm in and do CRPR and click on that Bloomberg rating, because the Bloomberg will actually give you more detail on exactly what that thing means. And you'll get some history, and you can, they do have different levels. So one thing that's really, and there is a high overlap between their number and the credit ratings for the firms that do have credit ratings. They will tell you if it's investment grade or below investment grade level. They'll tell you that. Now, even on the investment grade, they'll tell you what level they are. So you can get a lot out of that Bloomberg chart. They do quite a bit of analysis there. It's actually pretty impressive. And not only that, they actually share the formula with you. If you want to, I'm not saying you would do it, but if you want to deep dive on why your firm's probability of default is 0.7%, you can go through all the details and see it. You might find something in there we should be adding to this first part of the paper that I forgot to put in there. So it's probably very similar stuff to what we're doing, times interest earned and debt to EBITDA. And so there's the Bloomberg. Now, what do you leave in? What do you take out? You notice I took the 0.9% out because on consumer stocks, there are some of them that were like 10% probability of default, just off the charts. And I want to be able to see Walmart. You might take the 0.1 off. I like the 1.1 here because Walmart was below the 0.1. So that means they're in the top 10% as far as low probability of default. This is a great ratio. This is one of the ratios, obviously, I got from Bloomberg and didn't get from Capital IQ. And I still haven't checked. Has anyone tried Capital IQ for credit ratings? Anyone try to see if you can get them? I just don't know if that. You would think S&P would have credit ratings, but would they have Moody's ratings? That would be interesting. So there's liquidity and solvency in the overall. So that is, once you finish that, that's 39%. Paper 1. It is the hardest part. So hopefully you'll have your firms loaded. It doesn't look like many of you do. So do y'all have your firms loaded? Anyone have a major issue to yours, huh?
So there's, I got it loaded and sorted, but I want to sort it more to include just integrated and then refining companies.
Oh, yeah, try to have at least, someone was asking me, I would have it, try to have at least, if you try to have 20 companies, I think one of y'all said you had 16. I'm doing the 0.1 and 0.9%. If you have 10 companies, you're only kicking one out. It's not a big deal, 10 is awfully small for paper 3. Try to add more. Having Exxon and Chevron in there, I don't think it's all that horrible. I know you say they're massive companies, but they're doing very similar things. And so you have ratios that, adjust the size anyways. So I don't know if I get too much. The servicers and those type, I wouldn't do all energy definitely, but you could definitely include the big integrated oil. Anybody have a problem with just not having enough companies? I think aerospace was fine. You're doing, yours, you probably just use what I'd use for Walmart. What about UPS and FedEx? What did y'all use? Transportation? Because transportation, the problem with transportation is I never know where they're going to put the airlines. You don't want airlines in yours. That should be consumer discretionary, but I've seen some put, and I don't know what airlines. So if you see airlines in there, I would definitely take those out. I don't think airlines belong, but I would have the truckers, I would have the railroads in y'all's, that would be fine. I wouldn't put Amazon in there, but it kind of fits. But look at your lists, and if you're not sure, put them in there. Add more versus, there's paper 2, you're going to be a little more specific about your key competitors, but paper 3, you want a larger group. It's not that they have to have the same market and the same customers. It's the same general type of business. And you're trying to look at margins and turnover. So it doesn't matter that you have a railroad against a trucker. That's perfectly fine. Other issues with your firms? As you get into paper 3, I know most of y'all are like, I'm working on paper 2. What are you bothering me with? But as you get into paper 3, if you find something that you think is really fascinating, email it to me. We can bring it up in front of the class and talk about it, because it might be an issue someone else is having. Every time a student comes to me, I kind of get distracted because I want to just sit there and deep dive on that company, because I think every company is incredibly interesting. This is going to be your life the next 50 years, but there's a lot of there that's really quite fascinating and interesting. What I like to do when I'm doing these papers is I like to think, if I were to see CEO of this company, what would I be worried about? What would I be fixing? I think about with Bob Davis coming to USAA, saying, man, I got to fix this, this. What would you be doing as the CEO? And is that what the CEO is focused in on? And we did one company, it was El Paso Gas. I might have told y'all this story before, I can't remember. But overloaded with debt. It's a major problem. And the firm said, yeah, we're going to get our debt back in line, but we're also going to be expanding over here. Everything they were saying, there's no way they could do all of those things. They're not going to get their debt down if they're going to be massively expanding. And so our class, we spent the whole semester on that. And our solution was, you got to sell off the pipelines, pay down your debt. And then 3 months later, that's exactly what they did. And one of the students was so excited. Hey, we figured it out before they did. It's like really excited. But yeah, you just look at it and say, you're so overladen with debt, your hands are tied. You have no hope until you get this out of the way. All right, let's turn to the revenue. So activity ratios, top line growth, turnover, they all mean the same thing. So how's the firm generating sales? And very closely related to that is, what effort are they putting in to generate sales? There's a close relationship between activity ratios and liquidity, in certain ratios especially. So anytime you see the word turnover, if you live in the UK, turnover means revenue. I don't know why, but I always have to remember when I listen to the economists, when they say the firm's turnover is $24 billion. It's like, that doesn't make any sense in the US. So they just, for some reason, use the word turnover to mean revenue. But in the US, we mean a ratio. So a turnover ratio, you have something related to revenues divided by whatever's in the ratio. So asset turnover is sales divided by assets. Receivables turnover is sales divided by receivables. Inventory turnover is cost of goods sold divided by inventories. So you have something related to sales related to inventory. Now, let's think about this ratio with Anthony. He's got a special issue. Anthony has revenues that move up and down with gas prices. So he's going to show this turnover ratio going like that. But oil prices also move up and down. So a firm like Anthony's, I might not do an asset turnover. I might do, Anthony, you might think about this. I might do a gross margin turnover. And why would I do that? So their revenues are gasoline, their cost of goods sold is what? Oil. So they're going to be going like this. What's their gross margin going to do? It's going to be fairly stable. So if I use revenue, it's going to look like, wow, they did a great job when gas prices are up. They did a horrible job when gas prices were down. Is that really true? You're going to tell management, wow, why did you do such a horrible job in 2020? Well, no one was driving, but good news is oil prices were down. So our gross margin, and our revenue might have dropped a bunch, but our gross margins didn't drop as much. So there are some firms that a gross margin ratio might make more sense. Now, Anthony's may be the only one, but you have to think about that. If you have a revenue like Exxon or steel company where your revenue moves with a commodity price, you might want to think about using gross margin instead of using revenue. So Anthony, if you want to try that, let me know. We can sit down and try to get that to work. Not the gross margin as percent. That's what I have on your table. You have to do the gross margin in dollars. But you just, instead of doing asset turnover, you do gross margin. So heavy commodity driven firms, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now other firms are very volatile, but I wouldn't use gross margins. So you look at BlackRock, what defines BlackRock's revenues? Assets under management times pretty static management fee. So if the stock market falls 20%, what happens to BlackRock's revenues? Falls 20%. Would you use gross margin? No, because their expenses are about the same. They really are getting hurt, right? Talk about a high beta company. That's BlackRock. Stock market falls 20%. Their revenues fall 10%, 20%. Their expenses are the same. That's a high beta firm. Especially BlackRock this year, because they're mainly fixed income, and a lot of theirs is fixed income. This year, we've had assets, both stocks and bonds falling. So there, yeah, it's going to be volatile because their business is volatile, a little bit different. So I'm giving Anthony an excuse just because he has something that is somewhat of a spread, a crack spread kind of thing. Now a bank might be a little different. So bank, their revenues go up with interest rates, but so do their, their loan, they have loan portfolios go up, but their costs, their CDs and everything else. So bank, I might be tempted. Banks don't really have turnovers, so I'm kind of out of, not talking on ratio XEUs, but banks, they use the net interest margin. That's a much more normal number to use than look at the revenue. We don't really talk about revenue for banks. We talk about the net interest margin. What did you make in your auto loans minus what did you pay on your CDs and savings accounts? That's some more, you do look at the net there. But most firms, you're going to look at revenue to assets. You could do, you could look at a net working capital requirement. I've not tried that before, but you could look at revenues to net working capital requirement if it's a use of cash. That might be interesting for some firms. I've had a few students try that. So if your firm has a really massive net working capital requirement, looking at revenues to that net working capital requirement could be a really interesting ratio. It's not a normal ratio, that'd be an abnormal one, but you could certainly use it. All right, receivables turnover. Most of your firms don't have receivables. I don't think. Tamara, does your firm have receivables? Probably from some governments. Does UPS and FedEx have receivables? Yeah, maybe I could see they have big contracts. It's not, I noticed, talking about Chipotle, Chipotle has $387 million receivable. I don't know what that is. How many of y'all owe Chipotle money? Is that DoorDash? So what happens? I mean, well, look at it. It was 62 million. It was 62 million. Now it's 387. Would you want to know what that is as an analyst? Now, when they do DoorDash, y'all know the accounting for DoorDash? It'd be pretty interesting. That's a big part of their business, especially after COVID. And it's killing their margins, to be sure. They got to pay DoorDash all this money. Yeah, it's really interesting. I don't know where that's coming from. You would think they'd have some receivables because you go and you buy with your credit card and Visa, MasterCard, or the banks are going to pay them. You know, I don't know how that process works. But I don't think that's that, because that didn't suddenly change overnight. So I'd be interested if you're studying Chipotle. I would want to know the exact mathematics of the DoorDash, exactly how it works. What's the revenue flow? So someone goes through DoorDash. So you can buy a gift card for Chipotle from DoorDash, can't you? I've been doing that. It's like I'm finding DoorDash. If I don't want to think about gifts for friends, I go to DoorDash. And it's like, yeah, you got a Chipotle $100 gift card. Be happy. My neighbor, she's the head of the board of our condo. She does all this stuff for free. So I always get her gift card every December because I feel so guilty because she works for free and she gets so much hassle from the other condos. So I asked her, what's your favorite restaurant? And that was it. I gave you a DoorDash card from your favorite restaurant. So I don't know, you know, this is a big part of their business. I'd want to understand that. Now, HEB home delivery, that's a HEB employee, right? How do you pay HEB for their home delivery? You do that online through HEB, that goes all through HEB, I would assume. But you want to understand these businesses are changing, and are changing in ways that it's affecting their working capital, it's affecting their margins, obviously this is great for their revenue. You don't want to say, hey, we don't like DoorDash, you can't use it. What would happen to Chipotle is say, hey, no more DoorDash, we just can't take it. That would be disastrous. That's a big part of their business now. Would Chipotle want to hire their own people to home delivery? Do you want to have to say, hey, you know what? I use DoorDash, but anytime I use Chipotle, you have to go to their website. That's a hassle. So, you know, so you have to understand these businesses, but it's obvious something's going on. Now, the nice thing is, you know, it looks like it may be COVID related. The nice thing is, if you go to the 2020 annual report, they're going to have to talk about this. You can't have a number jump from 108 to 387 and not talk about it. So for most of you, I don't think receivables is an issue, but for Chipotle, you're gonna have to spend some time on that. Now, a Costco, you wouldn't think Costco has receivables, but they do have 1.8 billion. It's a small number for a firm with 59 billion, but it's not inconsequential. So I'm curious, is that Visa, MasterCard, or is there something else going on there? I really don't know that, but it's not a huge number for them, but it's curious to me. It's just like, who owns, I don't owe Costco any money. All right, so hires better on turnover ratios. I haven't seen too many students do receivable turnover, but look at it and see, just check and see. I mean, at least ask the question, does my firm have receivables? If they have $100 billion in assets and $32 million in receivables, then just ignore it. It's immaterial. If they have $100 billion in assets and $12 billion in receivables, yeah, you have to spend some time on it. All right, so use it as a materiality kind of threshold. The average collection period, again, well, it makes sense. You just take 365 and divide it by the duration. The ratios, that's supposedly how, on average, how quickly they collect the receivables. I don't think it's all that great of a number if a firm does mainly cash and credit card sales. You know, it's probably not that great of a number. I don't know why I keep changing my fonts. This is really, yeah, I don't normally do that. I need to go. Y'all need to make sure y'all don't do this on your paper because it really looks bad when you publish it. Now, inventory turnover is going to be important, and you can create your own inventory turn. So you might want to have an inventory turn. If you're a retailer, you have to talk about inventory somewhere in there. So you probably want to add that. Now, you could add it to the first part of the paper where you're talking about liquidity, or you can add it here. It works in both places. Firms should be getting better at inventory, but there are things affecting it. So what's happened here this last year, that might be an issue. Supply chain management, supply disruptions, those kind of things. You've seen Walmart and Nike having big inventory builds. And it was a challenge because suddenly Nike's sitting around doing nothing and COVID hits and suddenly everybody wants tennis shoes. And now they got to prepare for 2021. What do? Do you buy a bunch of tennis shoes again or not? It's a challenge to know what to do. Is maybe everybody's back at work now and they don't need tennis shoes, or maybe they bought tennis shoes, they went running 3 times and they're never going to run again. You know, who knows? So it's not easy for management to figure these things out, but they have to make a decision and then it shows up. And then you have day sales and inventory. That can also be a very good ratio to do. You do 365 divided by the ratio. You want that ratio coming down. You want inventory turn going up, and you want the days and inventory coming down. Those are both ratios you could add to your paper. This should be getting better over time, but it can jump because of what's happened in the last couple of years. It can certainly be an issue. All right. So what I want to do next time is talk about specific. Here's where you have. This is where you're most unique to your company. What is the specific turnover ratio your company should do? So Nike, I would probably use sales to marketing dollars. That just makes a lot of sense to me. For Costco's, sales per store, or sales per square foot. For UPS and FedEx, I'd probably do revenue per PP&E, but we can look and see if there's other things to do. If you're a service like Salesforce or Accenture, definitely revenue per employee. At UTSA, we did revenue per employee. That works really well. If you're doing airlines, it's available seat miles. You know, there's certain ones. If you're doing cruise lines, it's revenue per cabin, per berth. Hotel rooms, it's revenue per hotel room. Those are the kind of things every industry has their own thing. If it's Disney, what do you use for Disney? Disney looks horrible revenue per employee. Why is that? So stupid theme parks got all these employees. Is that a good ratio for Disney? It doesn't make any sense at all. What would you use for Disney? Well, for the cruise line, I would use this. For the movies, I would use this. Theme parks, I would use this. There is no good ratio for Disney. Some of y'all may have that issue. What would you use for Amazon? Revenue per square foot, you could do that, but my word, their revenue over a Whole Foods square feet. Microsoft could do revenue per square foot, but have you ever seen a customer in a Microsoft store before? They don't exist. So that doesn't make sense. It looks really good, but that's not how they make their money. They make money online. So you're going to have to stop. If you're not sure, we're going to probably default to revenue per employee. If your firm has property, plant, and equipment that's 30 to 40% of assets, you can probably use revenue per property, plant, and equipment. NVIDIA, I'll probably use revenue per employee. If you have a firm like NVIDIA where you have a lot of high-skilled employees, revenue per employee makes that really is where their revenue comes from. They got to develop these products. So, but we'll get into that. We'll make sure each one of your firms knows. If you're pharmaceutical, revenue per research and development costs makes a lot of sense. So there are some ratios that make a lot of sense. All right, let me stop it there. All right, let's start up here. I think to me the most interesting concept was this turnover. This where I really like that business breakdown with Cinnabon. There's a lot of asset turnover in there, and understanding your business from that standpoint is really, really important. So what you're trying to figure out is what asset, and the word asset you can almost put in quotes because it doesn't have to be on the balance sheet. So what expenditure, what asset, what value does the firm have that really ties to generating sales? So it can be people, it can be square feet, it can be marketing budgets, it can be research and development budgets. Those kind of things can all drive. You're trying to find what generates sales, and then you want to ask the question, can we do it more efficiently? So marketing budgets are a huge deal for heavy retailers where brand identity is their moat. So Nike has a moat an economic mode called brand identity, and they spend a fortune keeping that going. Cruise lines, they keep building the bigger ship, don't they? Isn't it just amazing how much bigger and bigger these ships go? They don't use them. You go on a ship and you can't do any of the stuff because it's too windy, but they still build bigger. They put golf courses on them that you can't use because it's too windy, or they put water parks on them. But that seems to be the thing, bigger and bigger ships. So what is the asset turnover of a 500 square foot ship versus a 1,000,000 square foot ship? What's the differences? You know, where are they getting that money from? Is it the excursions that they stop for? You know, all those kind of things. Hotel rooms. I was watching Andrew's commercial real estate class yesterday. It's not just hotel rooms. They also have parking. They also have vending. They also have room service, maybe a restaurant. You know, there's other things going on there, but the hotel room's the main draw. You're not going to get parking if you don't get someone to get the room. I mean, you do get some parking from non-residents, but you're trying to figure out that main hook. Things like Uber, AT&T, it's how many accounts do you have? So for Facebook, it's how many users they have that are on Facebook at least once a week. And that's the number that's been declining in the US, probably growing in some other countries. So that's pretty critical. Isn't that Elon Musk big deal with Twitter? How many of these are legitimate users versus these robot accounts? R&D for pharmaceuticals, hospitals, number of beds, number of hospitals, number of clinics, available seat miles for airlines. Airlines, it's how far are we flying? How many seats are full? Those are really, really critical. No one's doing utility in here, I don't think. So, but utilities have something called regulatory asset. You almost always want to look at it, revenue to regulatory asset. What a regulatory asset is, it's an asset the utility is allowed to price with the regulators. And that's a number you can get very, very easily off of Bloomberg. If you have a firm that is a pure pipeline company, then yeah, you can look at the mile. We tried how many companies, like 3 of your energy companies had pipeline miles. So it wasn't a real common thing, but you can pull that number. CapEx could be a number. That's the question you always have to ask is, what is their CapEx? What exactly are they spending the money on? Because it's, you know, it's kind of interesting for some firms. Property, plant, and equipment. You're an industrial. So that's where I say, look at your balance sheet. And if property, plant, and equipment is 40–50% of your assets, then revenue to property, plant, and equipment can be a good one to use. Makes more sense for Intel than for NVIDIA. So you just have to kind of look at the numbers. The key is 2 things. First, what is that asset most closely tied to revenue? And then what can the firm do to increase that? Every time you increase a turnover, you're increasing profitability. So let me give you a good example. McDonald's a few years ago suddenly saw huge growth in their earnings, and it all came from ATO improvement. Any guesses what they did? What could McDonald's do to greatly improve their revenue to assets? Well, close. Sell off stores. How do you sell off stores if you're McDonald's?
You got to sell your real estate.
Well, they have company-owned stores, but what else do they have? Franchises. Guess what they did? They converted a huge percentage of their restaurants to franchises. Now, what does that do? Let's think about it. What is revenue going to do? It can go higher or lower? Much, much lower, right? You were getting 100% of revenue. Now, what are you getting? You're getting a royalty. So revenue drops 85%. What do assets do? You had a $1 million building. Now what do you have? They drop 100%. What happens to your turnover? Skyrockets. The problem was McDonald's had this wonderful growth, but there's a limit, isn't there? At some point, they got to stop. So you can kind of run the numbers and say, okay, at some point you can't go, and they're not going to do 100% because they're always going to have their own company-owned stores to do experiments and those kind of things. This is the big value of a franchise. you lose control somewhat of your firm because you no longer have those. And the big issue for McDonald's is, are these workers their workers, right? That was a big issue in California. Are McDonald's workers, or are they the franchisees workers? If they're McDonald's, then they got to give them health care because McDonald's has millions of employees or hundreds of thousands of employees. It's a franchise. There's no health care because they don't have 50 employees. Becomes a huge issue. Uber is going through the same thing. That's why Uber's model is so great. How many cars does Uber own? Probably not very many, right? They let their drivers own the cars. So it's a great model. Now, I heard Uber saying, when we get autonomous vehicles, Uber's going to be a big into that. Well, that radically changes their whole business model. Now they have, instead of drivers, they're going to have all these assets. Can Uber really manage that well? Is that really a good business model for them? So that's what you're looking at. So for McDonald's, it looks horrible. Their revenue growth looks terrible. And yet their asset turnover goes really, really high. What about Adobe? What did Adobe do?
They switched to like a subscription model.
Right. From a one-time disc to monthly subscriptions. What did that do to their asset turnover? Their asset turnover is really pretty pathetic if you look at it. Because you also have to think about the margin improvement. There's two things going on. But Adobe did this and it greatly improved their financials. I know their stock dropped a bunch recently. That's because of some buyout they're going to do. So these are the kind of questions you need to ask about your firm. Is there something they could do that's radical that would impact asset turnover? And if there is, are they talking about it? Are they doing it? So the other one we talk about is Cinnabon. So Cinnabon had three things. They have franchise. So they didn't actually own, well, they probably had some company owned. I don't think they had many. I think that was going way down. Franchise. They had licensing. And they had CPG. Y'all remember CPG? I didn't know this word until I listened to business breakdown. CPG, any guesses? Consumer packaged goods. So they had franchisings, and then they started doing licensing, like with Burger King and, oh, I can't spell, Slotsky's. I have no, the sandwich shop. I can't spell sandwich. I think they still have it with Slotsky's, don't they? When I go by Slotsky's, I'll steal that. Where else I'll see Cinnabon? I don't think Burger King does that anymore. I think Taco Bell did for a while there, but those two smells don't work for me. Just like KFC and Taco Bell, that's like, this is like, I didn't like either of the smells before. You combine them, it's even worse. But Burger King, that was quite successful for them. I don't know why it stopped and why they shut it down. I don't know if that's, I haven't noticed Burger King still having that, but Slotsky's has definitely had that. And then they tried consumer packaged goods where they had to deal with, you know, put their product in the stores in a package already prepared. And the question is, most of these were asset turnover decisions. Some of them were margin decisions. But the question is, what is the impact? And if you listen to that business breakdown, what you discover is this is where they're really, really making their money, especially turnover, because it's very low assets and huge revenue. And Kat Cole said some of our franchise owners were saying, hey, you don't love us anymore. You know, we're like second fiddle. And she said, without you guys, we don't have this. Without you guys smelling up the airport, no one's going to get anything out of this. So you guys are our front. You're our face. Have you ever bought a Cinnabon in the airport? You've thought about it though, haven't you? You walk by, you're like, to me, anytime a flight's delayed, it's like free calories, everything's free, nothing counts. But I've never done Cinnabon. I've done other terrible things. But you know about Cinnabon, don't you? Because you go to the airport. If you didn't do that, you probably wouldn't know. So very interesting. You know, it's very much an asset turnover type of decision, but you also want to know the margins. No question. But Adobe, I want to know both of them. You want to know the math between the two. So, okay, my revenues are going to drop 85%, my assets going to drop 100%. That's interesting. Or my asset turnover is going to fall 10%, but my margins are going to go up 20%. Okay, I want to understand that dynamic, why it's happening, how sustainable it is, why is it happening? So for McDonald's, yeah, it's wonderful. Keep franchising. Well, it's not sustainable because eventually you run out of stores you can convert. So think about that from, I don't know if with your firms, if y'all have that kind of obvious kind of thing to do, but you know, obviously with the Valero, it's taking your existing refiners and making them more efficient, new equipment. So CapEx might be, let's just get more efficient engines in there. An airline might be buying a new Dreamliner, more cost efficient, more energy efficient, those kind of things. Gets you some good scores on your environmental. But there's a lot really to think about with this. Also, don't forget that you got the basic ratios. Inventory turnover is probably the most important one. I probably should add to the spreadsheet, but I haven't. But if you want inventory turnover, especially those that are doing retail, let me know. I'll build it in. I don't know what happened, went wrong last class where you got the same number all the way across. I must have a formula error somewhere in there. Yeah, capital IQ it's wonderful and also exasperating because it seems I have some blowups. But if you're interested in that, let me know. Now that we got Costco numbers in there, it might be interesting to see how Costco does on that. I would guess Costco's inventory turn is better than Walmart's, but those are both stores that do turnover extremely well. So I'm not sure about that. So asset turnover to me is, you know, to me, margins as you cut your costs, those kind of things. Turnover is where you get the most creative management. And that's why I so loves the Cinnabon, because she's thinking, I don't know what her background is in finance, but she's thinking financially, you know, very clearly understands, hey, if I can move, yeah, my revenues fall this much, but my assets fall this much, that's huge for my stockholders or my owners. That's the way you want to do it. So revenue growth can be due to increased capacity or improved turnover. Turnover is what we want. So if your revenues are growing 8%, while the asset to generate revenues growing 7%, you're not getting much turnover improvement. You know, most of your growth is coming from adding more assets. If your revenue is growing 8%, while the assets are growing 2%, then you're saying, man, you're doing something right there. Because the capacity is expensive, it's a lot of CapEx, it's a lot of hassle, it's a lot of management time. If you can reduce that and get more sales, you're good. So those doing Costco, I think we talked about it, you know, Costco's seems to have an extremely specific strategy for where when they build stores, how many they build and where they put them. So how many Costco's are there in San Antonio? And would you know them all off the top of your head? Are you that much of a Costco? It's the Costco. Let's see.
What is it for?
Well, there's one strategy is you build on 1604, I guess, but nothing in south. Do y'all see anything south? I think they stop at some point, so they don't have the Austin ones there. Yeah, that's much different strategy than say a Walmart. There's Walmart. Walmart, you know, oh, where's the one next to me? Boy, I don't know where I live. I mean, I do, but not on this map. That's Bandera, right? I'm not seeing the ones. Yeah, there's one Walmart where, yeah, this Walmart and this Walmart. I mean, I could jog from there to there. I don't think it's even 2 miles. They're just right on top of it. I really was shocked when they built this one. What else do you notice about the Walmart placement? Next to HEB, is that part of their plan? That does seem to be part of it. There's McDonald's. You notice a good spacing, though, the spacing, don't you? There seems to be a plan. I think Chick-fil-A they're the pickiest of all. It's really hard to get a franchise Chick-fil-A. Boy, that's a lot more than I thought, but they do have a spacing. I'm surprised these two, is this right next to us? Oh, these are yeah, I don't think the food courts count so much. Is there one across here?
Yeah.
Is there really? Okay. Well, La Cantera doesn't sound like a Chick-fil-A place, but okay. And then you go, you know, the worst of all, Subway. Just they're right on top of each other. There's all over the place, which is infuriating, right? They're just all over the place. So, and I don't know why I'm just in North San Antonio. There's got to be more. So somehow I limited it. But I mean, that's a big part of this. You don't want, there's nothing worse for asset turnover than to cannibalize your own product, to have two stores in the same location. And so that's extremely important. Subway has gotten a bad rap for building too many stores on top of each other. So you want to think about not just what your firm is doing, but what could they do? So what assets do they have, which is to me pretty interesting. What assets do they actually own? And then, you know, so yeah, I was talking about that with Adobe. What assets does Adobe own? It would be really interesting to see, because their asset turnover is very low. Like Musk looks like he's happy. I don't know what he just did. Probably an old folder. So they have $27 billion in assets. They don't have receivables, it doesn't look like. I mean, inventories. They do have receivables. That's kind of interesting. So their biggest asset is goodwill. That's over half their assets is goodwill. What does that mean? They've been acquiring a lot of other firms. Why did their stock price drop recently? They were acquiring another firm. Maybe we're like, you're really over. That's who is it? Yeah, Wayland talked about that last week in Investment Society. So can that affect their asset turnover? Yeah. What are the revenues of the firm they're buying, and what are they paying for it? They're paying a big premium, which they obviously are, with $14 billion in goodwill. That's going to bring their asset turnover. Do you throw goodwill out and then do their asset turnover? That's kind of you could. That'd be kind of a strange way to address it. But why is their asset turnover so weak? Is because they keep acquiring firms. What was your stock there, Colin? CECO? CECE. Okay. Let's see if their goodwill is a disaster here. This is a firm that said the only way we know how to grow is to buy another firm. So yeah, their goodwill is half their assets. But I'm always curious with firms, what are these assets? What do they have? Is it buildings? Is it receivables? Is it inventory? I forget the term firm I was looking at the other day at, oh gosh, I think it was NVIDIA. I think it was your company. I was talking to a student last night, and it had a massive accounts receivable. I think that was NVIDIA. It's like, why does NVIDIA have a large accounts? And they had an inventory. It's like, why do they have inventory? So $4 billion. What's that receivable? And then they had, why do they have 2.6 billion in inventories? That's strange. Yeah, it's kind of strange. Did you maybe search on the word inventory in their annual report and just see if they discuss it? It's not a huge number, but it's not minuscule. But then the thing you see with them is the cash. And this is the thing I was talking last night. They just borrowed a lot of money. They borrowed like $13 billion, and they got $21 billion in cash. Have you figured that one out yet? Why does a firm with $21 billion go out and borrow $13 billion? And last night he said, well, they're acquiring another firm. Like, but you're going to buy a $500,000 house and you have $2 million sitting in the bank. You're going to go borrow $500,000. It's kind of strange. So, you know, there's something going on there that's really bizarre. That, you know, it's kind of hard to figure out. Last night I was like, you know, we're raising more questions than we're answering because it's strange. I don't know this company that well. Some of this could be jumps because they did acquire another firm, and that they pick up those other firms' balance sheet items. But yeah, this is why I give you actual companies. It's noisy. There's stuff going on that's really hard to figure out, and you have to try to size it up. So if their asset turnover is falling because some asset suddenly jumped, and cash is a good example. You got a huge cash. Well, if you're just sitting on cash, it's gonna make your asset turnover look bad. But you know, cash, they could just buy their stock back, and that would go away overnight, and turnover. So cash, I might subtract cash out when I'm doing my turnover. Goodwill, boy, I'm not so sure about goodwill. Maybe what I would do is do an asset turnover with total assets, an asset turnover without cash, and an asset turnover without cash and goodwill, and just see. But then you'd have to do it with all your comparison companies as well. So it might be an interesting, you'd have to do a lot of work to get those data. That might be interesting. Some people look at the operating cycles as the days your cells sit in inventory, plus how long it takes you collect, minus how long it takes to pay your vendors. And that's usually a positive number that you want to come down, but it can be a negative number that you want to become more negative. Costco and Walmart, that's usually a negative number. So again, the strategies you can to improve these, spend more on marketing. If you're successful, shutting down inefficient stores. So that is true. If you can, like I always say, you know, with Kroger's and Albertsons shutting down, my guess is I really think it's as simple as revenue per store sorted from best to worst and shut down those bottom 20 or 50 or 100. I think it really is that simple. Online sales, as I mentioned, I think before with USAA, we started a new product, grew 70%. We didn't hire a single person to handle it because it's almost entirely online. They had to build the guts online, but that was a few $1 million in programming. Once they built it, it was pretty scalable. I mean, that kind of stuff you want to do all day. Moving to franchising, new services, McDonald's, when they started offering breakfast, just think about that. So a restaurant is horrible turnover, isn't it? Because people eat at lunch and dinner, and then you're sitting there the rest of the day. What if you could have people come at 8 a.m. and spend more at 8 a.m. than they were spending at lunch? Does that sound like a good idea? How many more buildings do you have to build? None. How much more equipment? I worked at McDonald's. I worked for Chick-fil-A for a week and McDonald's for a month. So I lasted much longer at McDonald's. But I remember when they went from, any of y'all worked at McDonald's? I remember when they went from breakfast to lunch, the entire process was this guy got this big scraper, went to the grill, and he just scraped all the breakfast off, and then he flipped the hamburger on. That was it. When they went to breakfast 24 hours, that caused some issues and problems, but that was incredible. You would have seen a really big surge in McDonald's. Their breakfasts are actually the only thing, they're not very healthy, so I don't eat them, but as far as fun to eat, it's about the only thing McDonald's has that I would eat. Does anyone eat Big Macs? Is that?
Love Big Mac.
Do you really?
I love them.
How can you love? Oh my word! Yeah, I haven't. I stopped eating at all those places, and I think my body, like, I detoxed, and I can't eat there anymore. I used to love Taco Bell too, and now I can't. It's not even a temptation at all. All right. I remember when Whataburger was the first to start doing credit cards. You think big deal credit cards, but they didn't accept credit cards. It's all cash. And boy, that was a huge win for them. And then everybody started doing it. So, you know, you do it, you can get a few months, few quarters, and then everybody else does it. You know, think about the airlines putting TVs in the seats. What did that do to their turnover? Did they really get more flyers because you got a TV in the seat? And if they all do it, does that have an impact? Any of y'all say, you know, I wasn't going to go to New York this summer, but they got that TV on the plane, and boy, I haven't seen that movie in a while. It's unlikely that's going to influence you. Now, if United had it, nobody else had it, would that influence you? Maybe that might have some influence, but if everybody does it, so that's the copying. That's why I talk about economic moat. If you're doing something that everybody else can copy with no problem, then it doesn't give you that advantage. Extended, hiring more sales reps, changing your sales incentives, having actual sales themselves and gimmicks. Obviously, if you have a sale, you cut your price is 10%, your volume goes up 20%, your turnover improves, but your margins decline. You got to look at the math. You really have to understand your firm, which is one reason I really love Business Breakdown, is they like to do a single store model. What does an AutoZone, what's their revenue? What's the cost of that store? The employees, the inventory. Let me see it on a unit level. Can I understand at a unit level? Same thing with Cinnabon. Let me understand Cinnabon at a franchise level. What's going on there? And then think about expanding that out. And you want to understand that turnover versus margin approach. Kat Cole, she talked about, they started doing the mini Cinnabon. And people say, the mini Cinnabon, why would you do that? That's less turnover. And she said, well, I forget how much a Cinnabon costs because I never bought one, but let's say Cinnabon's $7. Does that sound right? In the airport, it's $37, but normally it's $7. And a mini bun is like $3, let's say. She said, well, there's people that won't buy the $7 one, but they'll buy the $3 one and they'll buy a Coke, which has a massive margin, and they'll buy a couple other things. So end up spending $7 anyway. And we probably got more margin out of Coke than we get out of Cinnabon. She says, when you do the math, the mini bond actually works. And then what does the guy do? He buys the mini bond, and then his flight gets delayed and he buys 3 more. That's why airports are. So she was saying, looking at the math, yeah, it made sense, but people question it. Why would we take that major product we have that's been so successful and play with it? All right, so as far as your paper 3 goes, I'm only asking for 3 things. The first one's really easy. How fast are their revenues growing? But with one caveat. If the revenues are growing because they merged or acquired another firm, it's a little tricky. If the revenues went 20 billion, 40 billion, because they acquired another firm, that looks like great revenue growth, but their asset turnover won't improve because they just doubled their assets as well. So you do have to watch out for that. Some of your firms have been doing a lot of acquisitions, so be careful on that. And then we're going to talk about capacity versus turnover, and then the asset turnover ratio itself. All right, so let's jump to Walmart. But what questions do you have up to there? Y'all see the importance of turnover? I think it's pretty critical. If you go out to ratemyprofessor.com about 7 years ago, one student says, all he talks about is turnover. That's all he cares about. It's like, I don't think I spent the whole semester on it, but I do think it's I think it's one of the most important things management does. So yeah, I do think it's pretty important, but I don't think it's the only thing. Have I talked about anything besides turnover this semester? Have y'all heard anything else? I think I have. All right. So for Walmart, we're going to start with top line growth. You got to pick your own adjective or adverb, depending on how you word it. I use the word anemic. So, I think I told y'all before, be careful. You don't leave the anemic and then your firm's growing 12%. So make sure you pick the right term. Why do I say anemic for 2%? Well, I think of inflation before this year has been running about 1.5 to 2%. You would think a firm's revenue would just grow with inflation, period. You at least get inflation. You're going to raise your prices with inflation. So to me, they're barely keeping up with inflation. But what's worse, and this is something you got to be careful of, Walmart greatly benefited from the 2020 lockdowns. So when you look at it, it kind of came back. But if you look at that jump, 523, 559. So if you think about their growth, and y'all know how to edit this function, right? So what I recommend you do is take the CAGR and maybe put it over on the right side. But before you do, put a apostrophe before it so you don't copy it. So just copy it over as text and then come over here and take it out so you have it. And so if you look at the growth, it's the ending year versus the beginning year versus the number of years. So what I want to do is I want to look at pre-COVID. So you might want to do this. What was their revenue growth pre-COVID? So pre-COVID, that's E, column E, not column C. And so instead of 9, it's going to be 7. Essentially what it's telling you, if you get an error message, put the letters NMF. When you get an error message, when you go from a negative number to a positive number, that's obviously not going to happen with revenues. But you can see 2012, 2019, it's only 1.6% growth. And then if you do just COVID, .7% just for COVID. That was a huge win for them. So it somewhat tells you that COVID gave them a bump, and even with that bump, their revenue growth has just been really pathetic. Now, did they have an excuse for why it's so pathetic? It's because they moved to more groceries. Who knows why? This is a firm, remember, they're not just adding stores, they're also massively expanding in Latin America. That seems like a really horrible number, doesn't it? They're adding stores. This isn't their same, y'all know what same store sales is? Y'all heard that term before? Walmart report their same store sales. So what same store sales means is this is the growth in stores open 1/1 and 12/31. Well, for Walmart it'd be a little different, but only the growth in stores are open the entire period. So if you added a new store, or if you shut down a store, that's not in the numbers. So same store sales, and those had to be less than 225 because they've been adding a lot of stores. Just adding stores will make your revenue growth go. So I think this is a really anemic. I might even switch it to pathetic. I think that's a really, for a firm that has added about 1% in square feet every single year, you know, you can cut that number down even more. So their revenue per square foot has only been growing 1.33%, not even keeping up with inflation. Now, what's the other argument you make? Well, they buy a lot of stuff from China. So stuff from China hasn't had as much inflation as stuff from the rest of the world. So maybe that's part of it, but they're certainly not getting more traffic. So it's the same people coming in a store buying the same stuff, and all they're getting is the inflation. Wow. All right, so this paragraph, a lot of students lose points on this paragraph. You got to make a distinction between turnover growth and capacity growth. So their revenue per square foot, that's their turnover, improved 1.33%, and their capacity increased 1%. Now, let's be real clear on something here. I mentioned inflation. When do you talk inflation and when you not talk inflation? So revenue per square foot, that should grow at least with inflation. Revenue per PP and E just needs to be greater than 0. Why is that? I say, wow, revenue per square foot should grow at least 2%, but revenue per PP&E growing 0%, that's fine. Why would you say that? Why would you not want to say, hey, revenue per PP&E was 0.5%, didn't even keep up with inflation? Why am I going to take off points there? It's even if you, yeah, all my typos. You can say it didn't keep up with inflation on square feet, but you can't with PP&E. You need takers. So revenue, that's in what? In dollars. PP&E, what's that in? Dollars. Square feet, what is that in? Square feet. There's no inflation. So if you're taking revenue in dollars and divided by a non-dollar item, then you can talk about inflation. That should keep up with inflation. If you're taking a dollar amount and dividing by a dollar amount, don't compare it to inflation because they're both going up with inflation. All right, does that make sense? Is that clear? So what about revenue per employee? Where does that belong? Revenue employee went up 3.2%. Can you say at least it beat inflation? Makes sense, right? Number of employees there's no inflation there. You're not talking employee salaries. If you did employee salaries, then yeah, then you could talk about revenue per employee not going up with inflation. So if you're dividing a dollar by a dollar, don't mention inflation. If you are, I'm sorry, a dollar by a dollar, don't mention inflation. Dollar by non-dollar item like employees, or square feet or stores or pipelines or whatever, that you want to make sure they grow at least with inflation. So be careful on that. I get the word inflation in there too many times. All right, so I think that's pretty pathetic. Now, what could Walmart do to improve these numbers? So you do have curbside, you do have home delivery, you do have pickup. I haven't tried any of those. Is Walmart doing any home delivery? Are they really with their own cars? Or are they using Uber or
I
somebody?
haven't seen how it's actually.
I saw an HEB home delivery car, all fancy HEB. So it looked like it was an HEB asset. It wasn't like someone stuck an HEB thing on the top of his car. That's a pretty important decision, isn't it? Are we going to outsource this to Uber and have to pay their drivers? Are we going to buy our own cars and decorate them and send them out? What's the problem with having your own car saying HEB on it? You now have these agents for your firm out there tailgating, running red lights, honking. So, you know, and you're probably not talking graduate students and PhD students. You're probably talking high school kids, or probably not. They probably don't hire anyone under the age of 21 to drive around, I would guess. I don't know. I should. I do, when I buy a stock, I usually go out and buy their product just to see. So I'm kind of curious. So, but HEB I can't invest in. So, but yeah, I mean, what else could it do? Online. So Walmart online. So boy, I'd be really curious. Haven't been to Walmart in a while. How easy is it to use? So they've got their Halloween going. How many people buy clothes at Walmart? I do. I have no problem buying clothes at Walmart. Nice and cheap. Try it on. That's interesting. Something they added. Have y'all tried that? I don't think that would work for me, but where's
Like
the
how Amazon had that for the furniture in your home.
furniture home? Yeah. How easy is it to use? I don't know. How do I get the men's clothing? So I don't know how to do that. So men's shirts. Do they have a try it on for that, or do guys not care?
That way nobody has to know that you bought it.
Yeah, I don't see a try it on there. Reebok for $10. So a lot of cheap stuff. Roadkill t-shirts. I don't know. Have y'all been buying from their website? And how did they get you there? What's the incentive to get you there? So students tell me the incentive is pickup. They do have delivery, so there's delivery, 1-day shipping, 3-day shipping. So you've got some options. You compare that to Amazon, obviously, or Nordstrom. Oh, I can't spell Nordstrom. How do you spell Nordstrom? Is that a site you can buy stuff on? Did I get it right? Boy, is that Thanksgiving? They're already Thanksgiving and Christmas. Are they already doing that? I don't see anything I would ever wear on any of these sites. So, so I do like, you know, for retail, I do like to go to their website and just what I experienced. I tried HEB curbside and I just found it to be a horrible experience. I wish HEB, I think I probably told you that. I wish they would just take my credit card bill every month and they would just convert that to some file and tell me this is what you bought. Do you want to rebuy that again? And I can go in and just change the numbers. That would be wonderful.
I had a personal observation that once they started doing when they pick people groceries out, it ruined my HEB experience. Because now this person is pushing a cart down the thing. It's in my way. Every
Oh.
time I turn the corner, it's another person trying to fill this order. And so it just ruined my.
Well, I thought they fulfilled some of them off-site, but maybe not.
One
I haven't.
right there at 604 Boulevard, that's a real thing.
Hmm.
But I just don't like it.
They may have certain stores they do it in and they ship it to the others. That's possible. I mean, that's part of, you know, that's why you got to get in the mind of management. How are they going to actually get this accomplished? We as consumers think it's a real easy thing, but they're actually have to make employment decisions. They have people that are skilled to do that. Is it harder to do that? What if they pick the wrong bananas or they pick the wrong stuff? There's errors, those kind of things. You know, if there's errors when you go shopping, that's your fault. You come home with the wrong thing, but if they make mistakes. So yeah, there's a lot of issues there. Now, I'm not seeing anything about pickup or delivery. Maybe I should buy something. I can't see anything I would for him. Boy, I'm not seeing anything I'd buy. Sports stuff. How far down do I have to click before they ask me if I want to add the bag? I'm not going to actually buy it. So you have to account first. So, you know, how easy is it to use? Would you come back? Is there a reason for you to go there? Try to find the same item at Amazon, Walmart, Nordstrom, and if you can find the exact same item, what is the cost difference? What's the cost for shipping? How many days? So, you know, is Nordstrom trying to pull more traffic in through their website? And what impact would that have on their turnover if they did that? What impact does curbside have on margins and turnover? You're always thinking that. That's why these are such critically important decisions. Right. So I did go get the actual inflation numbers. So their revenue per store has not been keeping up with inflation. You can do that if you'd like. And then we have a graph of it. On this graph, I decided to leave the 0.9% in because I know that's Costco. So I kind of, Costco's way up there. Costco kills on turnover and they're horrible on margin. That tends to be the scenario. Firms that are great on turnover tend to be horrible on margin. Firms that are horrible on turnover tends to be great. Adobe's a good example. Adobe looks terrible on turnover because of that like goodwill, but they have incredibly good margins. They can charge a lot for their product because they're somewhat of a monopoly. So I left them in. You might kick out the 0.1 and 0.9. Like if I were doing Costco, if my 0.9 and Costco line are the same line, that helps me know that wow, Costco is one of the leaders in the industry on that. I don't know if that's what you're seeing on your chart, that they're just way up there. So Walmart's been just really, really flat. And here they shouldn't be flat. They should be going up with inflation. So that makes me a little bit nervous. Why is that such a flat number? All right, so real critical here, students lose points on this just by not, I had students talking about, let's look at Walmart's growth in revenue per square foot and growth in revenue per property, plant, and equipment. And it's like, no, you gotta compare the revenue per square foot to whatever the per is. Revenue square foot to growth in square foot. If it's revenue per employee, you do revenue per employee growth to growth in employees. You got to make sure you're comparing those because the employees is the capacity, revenue per employee is the turnover. And then just basic asset turnover. You can see again, Walmart's much better here. And it's probably because their stores really aren't that, they're pretty efficient to build. So on a per square foot, they're kind of average per store. They do much better. They have huge stores and are very efficiently built. So I say it's an industry struggling because of Amazon, because of lack of brand identity, brand loyalty. I do think there's been some issue now with more of these specialized stores like the Home Depot types that are getting larger and starting to, you know, do stuff that people just like going to a place that has a whole bunch of limited kind of things. All right, so Walmart's actually very, very good on turnover, but not improving. So is there anything they're doing that's going to jump that number up and get it stronger up? You know, if all they can do is add more stores, that's not it. If you could go to Walmart and just, you know, ask people outside, why do you go to Walmart? Why did you go down the street here? They probably wouldn't appreciate it that if you did that. Or when you get in your car and you're deciding where to go, what's your thought process? How are you deciding what's most important to you? What's most important to consumers? Is that changing? And then something you might have to talk about with some of your firms is, did COVID permanently change things? So if I were doing AMC, has AMC been permanently changed? Do you think their business has radically been changed forever and ever and ever? Or is it can go right back to normal? Their earnings per share, negative $20. They went from $1 to negative $20. How many of their forecasts had that in it in 2018? Yeah, boss, I did a scenario. One of my scenarios, we're losing $20 per share. It's like, are you crazy? There's no way we're going to lose $20 per share. How much did their revenues fall? From 5 billion to 1 billion. How many businesses can survive their revenues falling from 5 billion to 1 billion in 1 year? And your net income going from negative $1 to negative $20. Now they're back to negative $2. But will they ever get back to $5 billion in revenue? Huh?
Do you know anything about the San Chico theaters? Prior to COVID, they had these big growth projections all around the city. They were doing San Chico company theaters, and now you drive by and they'll say San Chico real estate company they're trying to sell.
Possibly. No, I don't keep. Yeah, definitely not. When's the last time you were in a movie theater?
They're like 3-4 months ago or something.
Yeah, you can add years to that for me. Yeah, I can't remember last time. I think the last time.
Matrix 2, or sorry, the new Matrix was the last one.
Yeah, all the old people like me were watching Top Gun, but I didn't like the first. I didn't go see the first Top Gun. So I think my last one was Toy Story. I left the CFA exam and I said I need a movie where I don't have to think, and I picked one to Toy Story, and I think that's the last time I ever went to the theater. But what do y'all think? Will they ever get back to 5 billion? Is that permanently? Have y'all permanently changed your movie going? Have the movie producers permanently changed how they're doing that? So these are important questions on turnover. So
Chinese firms bought it, a lot of Hollywood production companies, and that's changed a lot of the.
well, and that's the other thing with movies is overseas, emerging countries, there's other places you can sell these things, but AMC, what? So, that's the question. AMC, so people aren't coming to the theaters, but they do own real estate. So is there a real estate play there? Obviously, they're gonna have to think through that. A friend of mine from USA was the CFO of, I think, AMC. But I've tried to contact him to come talk to my classes, and he won't reply. He's a friend on Facebook, but he won't reply. So he may just not be on Messenger or something. But I'd be interested. I think he retired before COVID, so smart. He got out at the right time. But he's a really entertaining speaker. I think he would give a really good insight if he just replied to my emails. All right, so it's struggling. What can they do? What did COVID do to them? Will they get back to normal? Is there a new normal? And when you say new normal, does anyone really know yet? Are we still too close to the crisis to know yet? Those are things you have to think through. And then Walmart, Costco, they picked up all this new business because of COVID. Is that going to go back to normal? And they're going to throw that out. Those are questions you have to address. All right. Any questions on turnover? Turnover, I think, is a pretty critical one. A lot of creative thinking about just what's going on with this firm. All right, let's talk about margins. So with margins, we talk gross margins and net margins. I think on the paper I use net margin, but I messed up. I shouldn't have done that, and we'll talk about that. But on gross margin, revenue minus cost of goods sold. So that's the markup. I don't trust the number because I don't trust what the accountants put in the cost of goods sold. I don't know what they decide to put in and not put in, and if you can really compare two companies to each other, but it is what it is. Gross margins tend to be really, really stable for most businesses. You don't usually see gross margins doing that. So they tend to be very, very, very stable. You expect the firm, obviously, like Walmart, to have an extremely stable gross margin. 25, 25, 25, 25, 25, 26, 25, 25, 25, 25. Anyone want to forecast Walmart's gross margin next year? 32.7, 16.8. Would you be confident with a 25? Pretty confident. And Costco even more so, just straight line all the way across. What does that mean? Coffee prices go up. What is Walmart going to do? They're going to raise their coffee prices. They're not going to eat. Why can't they eat margins? Well, their gross margin is 25%. Adobe's net margin is 35%. Very different businesses. Microsoft's gross margin is what, like 80%, 85, 90%? They're just ridiculous numbers. So when you have this thin margin, you're not going to when people say, hey, prices are rising, it's shrinking margins. It's not going to do that at a Walmart because they don't have anything. There's nothing there to shrink. They're already as thin as they can go and make this business work. So very, very thin margins, but very, very consistent margins. So that's the gross margin. Does it really mean anything? That's the thing you have to kind of wonder is what are they putting in their cost of goods sold? And I don't know that. So look at Chipotle. Cost of revenue is $6 billion. What's in that number? Obviously lettuce, black beans, tomatoes, that's in there. The hourly workers, do you think? The utilities in the building? Marketing's not, that'd be below the line. What about 5% of the CFO's time? Are they allocating to cost of goods sold? What did they teach you? And I wasn't paying attention in my accounting class on this because I don't think they said it. What did your accounting class say about the rules for what goes in the cost of goods sold? Is it well defined? Or can management, how much leeway does management have to manipulate that number? Can you really compare cost of goods sold between two companies? What about NVIDIA? NVIDIA has a cost of revenue. What in the world is in their cost of revenue? Pretty interesting question, isn't it? I have no earthly idea. I bet there's a lot of salaries. I bet that's mainly salaries. Maybe there's some servers, I don't know, but what's in that number? Microsoft, 62 billion, but they also do cloud stuff. How many of their servers are in their clouds? But man, look at that gross profit, 135 versus 198. What is that, like 60%? It's just a massive number. So these firms are putting stuff in cost of revenue. I would even do like an Accenture. This is Accenture. This is a consulting firm. They got $42 billion in their cost of revenue. That must be all their consultants, you would think. What else would they be putting in there? I don't think it's postage stamps or it's $42 billion. They have a really thin gross profit. But if you think about Accenture, they don't sell a product. So what's their cost of goods sold? It must be people. It has to be people. So I don't know. I don't know if you go through their annual report. I don't know if y'all have ever tried going to the annual report and just searching or find income statement, find whatever they call that line, if it's cost of goods sold or cost of revenues or whatever, and you go find that annual report and see if they have a footnote that explains that. I think it'd be really, really interesting. If any of y'all find it, let me know. Let's talk about it in class because I'll be really, really interested to see if these firms give you a good indication. Now, net margin. I don't like the term net margin. So there's several terms. There's net income margin, which is straightforward. It's just a net income of the firm over revenue. Anytime you see margin, you divide by revenue. There's operating margin, which is whatever it is. I think most people, when they say operating margin, they mean EBITDA, but I'm not 100% that's always the case. But EBIT margin and EBITDA margin, the problem the mistake I made on your paper is I put net margin in the title. So I'm going to go now and we're going to see what that actually is. And I want you to change the title of your file. So it's chart 12. So let's go to the data for graph building in chart 12. So chart 12 is using M58. So M58 is using M62. M62 is using Bloomberg Pace Values U55. See how you have to go around the world here. So it's EBIT, all right? After all of that, we found I'm using EBIT margin. But I didn't tell you that. So this is one of my pet peeves, and I did it myself. I don't like the word margin without it being explicit. Is it net income margin? Is it EBIT margin? Is it EBITDA margin? I don't like operating margin. So change chart 12 to EBIT margin, not net margin. EBIT margin is a net. What do I mean by net? It's a gross margin minus other expenses. So it's net of other expenses. So we're using EBIT. We could have used EBITDA, but we use EBIT. So be real clear on that. So EBITDA margin, EBIT margin, net income margin, operating margin. What they really mean by operating margin is net income, we're going to make some adjustments, but a lot of times I've noticed, especially some of the case studies from Harvard, when they say operating margin, you can type, you can't always find the numbers because they do make some adjustments. You can type multiply closer to EBITDA. But it's a really squirrely number. So I prefer just be really explicit in what you're doing. So gross margin is looking at the markup. So if they have strong brand identity, you should have a really good gross margin, like a Microsoft. If brand identity, and they're a discounter, you're going to be much thinner on that. It gives you some sense of their pricing power if they got strong gross margins. Now, net margin has a couple of things going on here. So net margin has the gross margin in it, but net margin also has what we call operating leverage. Have y'all used this term before, operating leverage? Have y'all heard that previous class? You heard it in my class, but y'all remember what we said 2 years ago? Operating margin is our leverage, operating leverage. So you know what financial leverage is? That's how much debt they have. So what's the leverage of operating leverage? Fixed costs. So how much fixed costs they have. So financial leverage is the fixed costs of debt, because debt has a fixed interest payment. You got to make it no matter how well you're doing. That's going to leverage up your income. Operating leverage is looking at the fixed costs other than debt. Things like depreciation. So a firm with a lot of operating leverage is going to have a very volatile net margin. It's going to be a much riskier firm. A firm with low operating leverage with a lot of variable costs have much more stable net margins and will be a lower beta, less risky firm. So when you're looking at the net margin, it can relate to expense management. If their net margins are improving, it can be because they're getting more efficient. They're adding new technology or whatever. It can be a reflection of their pricing power that's coming down from the gross margin. They're able to charge more. And it can be a reflection of operating leverage. And what you'll notice, operating leverage, if they have a lot of fixed costs, then a 5% growth in revenue is going to cause a 15-20% growth in net income. So a firm with a lot of fixed costs, small change in revenues will cause a large change in net income. So operating leverage makes them more volatile, makes them more risky, makes their beta higher. So now you probably remember this accounting class where y'all did. Y'all remember the contribution margin? Or did y'all completely forget that class? I took I had two management accounting classes at UT Austin. The lower division one was really hard. The upper division one was a piece of cake. It was the same class twice, but just much easier. It was kind of like a great to have one easy class I could do. But y'all remember that stuff? Revenue minus variable costs. And then you got to figure out your break-even point so that you cover all your fixed costs. Remember doing all of that stuff? It sounds really good. And for some places, it works really well. If I started a franchise, I would very much be using that analysis. Because you do a franchise, you do have variable costs that are really variable costs, and you do have fixed costs. Most businesses don't. Like at USAA, what is USA's variable costs? Well, obviously their claims. One has an accident, but not exactly drug related, but there is some relationship there. But most of USA's costs are fixed costs. And a lot of firms, most of Microsoft's costs are fixed costs. Most of NVIDIA's costs are fixed costs. Pharmaceuticals. You know, you go into recession, what's the pharmaceutical going to do? They're not going to cut all their scientists because when the economy comes back, they want them back. You know, you just keep paying them. So a large portion of these major firms, a large portion of their costs are fixed costs. As even for a Walmart and a Costco, their fixed costs, their their cost of goods sold is variable. That goes up and down with revenues, but once you get below line, they tend to be fairly fixed costs. So it's hard to do that contribution analysis with real life firms, the major firms, because they just have so many fixed costs. And so how do you actually figure this out? So we'll see this. We're going to do this on paper 5. Some of y'all have done this before with me. So one thing I was thinking, okay, let's take the standard deviation of the margins. So let's take the standard deviation of gross margin. What's that going to tell you? Well, if a firm has a really, really steady gross margin, that probably means they have a very inelastic demand. Because when their cost of goods sold go up, they raise their prices and they don't lose any volume. They keep the same gross margin. So that's good. Inelastic demand, like a cigarette, Philip Morris. Taxes go up on cigarettes, they just charge more. People buy the same number of cigarettes, their gross margin stays steady. If you have a volatile gross margin, you probably don't have pricing power. Your costs go up, you're going to eat some of that, it's going to shrink your margins. So I look at volatility margins and it tells me something about elasticity of demand. The volatility of net margin is a pass-through again of the gross margin, but I actually think firms with high fixed costs should have more volatile net margins. So that's one way I try to calculate it. And that's what we're going to use. Some of y'all seen my spreadsheet on that. And maybe I'll show it to y'all here. I've had some students try this. You can try it. You take EBIT and you regress it against revenue, and that slope is something. I don't know what it is, but it's a number. But maybe you do that and you can compare it to the slope of another firm in the same industry. The higher the slope, the more fixed costs they would have, the more volatile it is. You might be able to do that. The question, do you use quarterly data or annual data? If you use quarterly data, you get more data points, but then you got a lot more seasonal noise. Use annual data, you don't have as much years, and the company's been changing over time. So it's tough to get a good sample size when you do that. So it's just going to create a lot of noise. So I'm not sure if it's meaningful. I think it's cool when students try that because it's an interesting analysis. You can, with a firm like McDonald's, go back 40, 50 years and get a lot of data to do it, even on an annual basis. Whether it's telling you that story, I don't know, especially with McDonald's going from company owned to franchise, that's kind of a huge impact on these numbers. You would think the franchise model is far more stable, you would think, but who knows on those type of analysis. Let's see if I can find that chart real quickly, because I think I put it out there for y'all. Yeah, it's this one, data from Bloomberg. So how many of y'all seen this file before? I know I'm the only professor that uses this. So those who took my business finance class, right? Oh, and my investment class too. We use it in there too. So what I recommend you, when you won't get to this until paper 5, but what I recommend you do is find your company first so that you're on that page, and don't hit escape if you're in Zoom. And then here you just do equal, go find your company. It brings in the numbers. So you can see what I do here is I take the standard deviation of their gross and net margin. So Walmart's net margin standard deviation is less than 1%. We just saw that, right? Well, we saw it with the gross margin especially, but very, very stable. The typical stock in the S&P 500 has a standard deviation of net margin of 7.4%. So which firm would be easier to forecast? Obviously Walmart. You have a pretty good idea to do that. And then y'all know my favorite on this one. Good old Costco. Probably the easiest. So your paper 4 is like, I mean, really pretty simple. Oh, word, look at that, 0.24%. That's not a hard firm to, and look at the gross margin, 0.31%. That's not 31%, that's 0.31%. And you can definitely see it in the numbers, because here's their gross margin, 12.3, 12.4, 12.5, 12.4, 12.3, 12.3, 12.3, 12.7. Wow, they had some great years there. Very, very, very consistent, and then their net margin, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 2.5, had a bad year, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3. Yeah, that's so easy to do. And you look at a Tesla, and these are this is the gross margin. This isn't the net margin. Their gross margin 88%, -7%. How do you get a negative gross margin? How do you, the cars that you sell cost more than the revenue you got? 8%, 26%, 30%, 7%. That's not Walmart, is it? Even though if I showed you this, you say, well, that's definitely not Walmart. Walmart would go out of business if their gross margins look like this. 22, 20. Now they're getting a lot more stable, aren't they? Become a more normal business. If you look at their gross margins, they're much better than a typical car manufacturer. But they are coming, they're coming more stable. And then their net margins is ridiculous. 109,000% negative, -500%, -46, -125, -123. At least now they're getting more consistent. -95, -3. They had a really good year. And then finally, 2 years. Finally, they got the standard deviation of their margin is 27,000%. So is that because of fixed costs? It's a new business just starting out. There's a firm with a -500,000% net margin. I have no idea who that is. Too Simple Holdings. That sounds, who knows. So that's my theory. My theory is if there's fixed costs, it should come out in the volatility of net margin. That should be the indication. I can't think of any other way we can really get that. You can stop and think about it. And we'll talk about this in paper 5 some, but think about what fixed costs do they have. So if you have a high skilled labor force, salaried, and these are really critical people like a pharmaceutical, you don't want to lose them just because you're having a bad year, because they have your secrets and they're hard people to get. They're expensive to hire. Well, you're probably going to have heavy fixed costs. If you have a lot of property, plant, equipment, and you have depreciation, depreciation is a fixed cost that's going to cause your income to be more volatile. If you have unionized labor, unions have a lot of fixed costs. They have contracts that go out 5 years. So you have to pay them no matter what. General Motors had thousands of workers they were paying that weren't even working. They were just sitting there in furlough, and they just kept paying them. Those are heavy fixed costs. You think about Nike with that marketing, though, although Nike's marketing moves pretty consistently with their revenues, so that does give them somewhat of a fixed variable cost. If I were to put Ford in here, you might think Ford would have a very, very volatile. Oh man, there's a lot of Fords. There we go. Would have a very, very volatile net margin, but you'd be surprised. That they're actually below average. Why is that? Well, because Ford has a bank. It's called Ford Motor Credit. Banks are they have a very stable net interest margin, and that's a big, huge part of Ford. And so it declines all the volatility of the auto manufacturing. In fact, that's probably where they make most of their money. They're probably trying to make money off the financing and just hope you buy a car and they can charge you a good rate for it. So it is surprising sometimes that some firms you think, now they do have a lot of debt. This is debt to equity. That's the financial leverage. But why am I showing you this for paper 5? What do you need this for? You got to come up with a beta. All else equal, higher debt, higher beta, higher fixed costs, higher betas. So you're going to need it for the beta calculation. So we will get back to this and we'll use it in paper 5, but it's not bad to think about it in this paper. You could even, this part of the paper, if you wanted to, run that file against your firm and some of its competitors and just see, not only, let's say in your paper, you say, hey, their net margin is really stable. Maybe you want to prove it to me. Go out and find 5 companies and compare your company to them, because you have the spreadsheet that's pretty fast to use. Now, Tamara, your firm's not in there yet, so we'll have to add it. So I have to add yours and who else? Vance's. I got to add y'all to use companies. So don't let me forget that, to put them in there, because we're going to look at them as well. All right, so what we'll do next class is we're gonna start margin with Walmart. Y'all see how we're going? Just going right through paper 3. So if anyone's having trouble with their file, something not coming in, just email it to me and I'll fix it. Like Colin, if you can't get Capital IQ to work at all, just tell me. But at least have your competitor set up. You know, have that at least set up, and then if you do that, I can run it from home in a few minutes. So don't let it go much longer. All right, what questions y'all have? Is everything going well?